March and April went by, and Olaf had gathered good fleet enough in the Thames. But there was no word of Knut's return, though the dread thereof hung heavy over all the land, in such wise that no man could plan what he would do without the thought rising up, unless the Dane comes, seeing that each day might bring news of him. No man knows now what that terror and uncertainty was like to have ever in one's heart the fear of that awful host that seemed to sweep from end to end of the land before a levy could be gathered to meet it. There had been time to gather a levy now against the coming of Knut, but naught had been done. Sick at heart and impatient was Olaf, for England's rulers would not take care for her safety. Then came word of a great council to be held at Oxford, and we hoped much from that, but 2 days after it had been held there came to us, angry and desponding, Ulfketel, our East Anglian earl, and told us how things had gone as ill as they might. Few words enough are needed to tell it, but none can know what harm was wrought thereby. Whereof Olaf says that a good leader will act first, and call his council afterwards. All the best of England were there, not only Saxon thanes of Wessex, but also loyal Danes of the old settlement, and had the king spoken his will plainly, all would have been well. For of the Danish nobles, Eudred of Northumbria and the 2 earls of the old 7 boroughs, Sigefirth and Morcar, were at one with our Earl and Edmund for gathering a great levy, and keeping it together by marching through the Danelaw, and calling on the Danish thingmen, in the towns they yet held, to surrender. That plan was good, and would have been carried out, but Edric Streon rose up and reminded Ethelred of how the march through Lindsey had done more harm than good. Knut will not return, he said, and messages to these Danish garrisons with promise of peace if they surrender will be enough. But if we fall on them, they will grow desperate, and will send for Knut to help them. If we win them to peace, Knut cannot come back. Thereat Sigefirth of Stamford spoke hotly, minding Streon that the harm was done in Lindsey by pillage and burning wrought among peaceful folk, who were thus made enemies to the king. The thingmen would submit quietly if they knew they must, but if they were left, they would send word to Knut that there was no force to oppose him. But the words of Streon prevailed as ever, and the council broke up, and the nobles fell to feasting, while this foolish message was sent to Sweyn's veterans in their towns. Then Sigefirth and Morcar made no secret of their belief that Streon was playing into Knut's hands for reasons of his own. Wherefore Streon sent for them in friendly wise, as if to recall his words, and they went, and came from his house alive no more. Then their men went to avenge their lord's deaths, and were driven into St. Frithswite's church, and that was burnt over their heads. Now the 7 boroughs will welcome Knut, said Ulfketel, and Lindsey looks for him, so he has a clear road into the heart of England. Then I saw that Streon surely wrought for Knut, else was he a more foolish man than was thought, for all held him as the most skilful at statecraft in England. Then said Ulfketel, Eudred has gone to mind his own land, and I have come to ask you to help me in East Anglia. And in the end it came to pass that Olaf gave his new fleet into the hands of the London thanes, for Ethelred seemed to care not for it, and took his own ships only, and we sailed first of all to Malden. Little trouble was there, for the Danes who held the place submitted, being too few to fight us, and we gave their arms to the citizens, and mounted all of our men whom we could, and so left the ships and marched towards Colchester, along the great road that I had last passed as a fugitive in the years that seemed to me so long ago. It was strange to me as we went, and the mist of time seemed to pass away, so that all began to be as plain to my mind as if that flight had been but yesterday. There was nothing of the wayside happening that I could not remember well. But all the roadside was changed, for the cottages were gone, and the farmsteads stood no longer in the clearings. I know not what tales of terror I might have heard concerning the burnings of these homes. Where the thralls' huts had been were but patches of nettles and docks hiding heaps of ashes, and the farmhouses were charred ruins. And we saw now and then a man, skin-clad and wretched, seeking shelter in the woods in all haste as we sighted him. But I had no need to ask aught. I knew only too well what manner of tales might be told here, as everywhere in Sweyn's track. As we drew nearer Colchester, and the village folk began to learn who we were, and so would gather with gifts for the good-natured Norsemen who came to release them from the tyranny of the Thingmen. Now and then a face that I knew would start, as it were, upon me from among a little crowd. But none knew me, nor were they likely to do so. Hardly could I think myself the same as the careless boy who had watched his father ride away to the war. Indeed, I know that I changed less in the 10 years that came after this than in the 4 that had gone by since that day. For in those 4 years I had become the hardened warrior of many defeats and but this one victory. Now when we reached Coggeshall village, word came to us that the Danes were gathering in force in Colchester, and that they expected Olaf to besiege them there. "I will waste no time under Colchester walls," he said, "but will strike inland a little, then they will come out and give us battle in the open to stay our march." By this time the loyal freemen of Essex had gathered to Ulfketel in good force, and Olaf thought it would be well that he should march along the road that leads from Coggeshall to Dunmow and take that town, which is strong, so that the Danish forces should not join against us. Therefore he left us, and would go northwards from Dunmow, taking the towns from thence to Thetford and Norwich, and he should go to Ipswich and maybe to Dunwich after this. So would all East Anglia submit. And all went well with Ulfketel until the time came when he must turn back in haste, as I must tell presently. Now, after he was gone, Olaf thought that it would be well to cross the Colne and Stour rivers, and so cut off the Sudbury Danes from Colchester if it might be done. "Then there is no better place than my own," said I, "for the road on either side of the Stour can be guarded at bears, and I know all the country well." That pleased Olaf, and he said that we would take up some strong position there, and so wait to draw the Danes into the open, or he thought that one battle would do all for us. Thus I came back to the home that I loved and longed to see again. And when we came in the early morning to the place where the great mound of the Icenian Queen towers above its woods, I know not how my heart was stirred. I cannot say the things that I felt, and Olaf said, "Let us ride on alone and see your place." Then we came swiftly to the crest of the hill, and I could see all that was mine by right. But it was a piteous sight for me, and my rage and sorrow made me silent as I looked. The stockading that had been so good was broken and useless, and the church was in blackened ruins. Standing among the houses were black gaps among them also showed that the Danes had been at work and that none had had heart to rebuild. Black were the ruins of my home on the hill above the village, and across the mere woods one burnt gable of Hertha's home stood alone above the hill shoulder to show where Osgod had dwelt in the hollow of the hills beside the ford. Then we rode across the bridge and into the street unchallenged, for all the poor folk had fled from before us thinking that we were some fresh foes. Very strange the deserted place looked to me as I sat on my horse on the familiar green, and saw the river gleam across the gap where the church had been, and missed the houses that I had known so well. "Call aloud, Redwald," said Olaf. "It may be that your name will bring some from their hiding." So I called, and the empty street echoed back the words. "Ho, friends! I am Redwald, your thane. Will none come to greet me?" There was no answer, and Olaf lifted up his clear voice. "Ho, Ethelred's men! Here is help against the Danes." Then from under the staging by the riverside where the boats land their cargo, crept 2 men and came towards us slowly. And one was the thrall of mine who would have gone to Wormingford for me on the night when we fled. His silver collar of thraldom was gone, for the Danes had taken it, and his face bore marks of long hardship, but I knew him instantly. So I called him by name, and he stared at me fixedly for a moment, and then cried aloud and ran to me and fell to kissing my hand and weeping with joy at my return. Nor could I get a word from him at first. Then more of the people came from one place or another, timidly at first, but growing bold as they saw these 2 men without fear of us, and by the time that Olaf's warriors came over the bridge there were not a few folk standing round us and looking on. One by one I knew their faces, though years of pain had marked them sorely. But none knew me at first, though doubtless they would do so if I called to them as I had called to Bran the thrall. now was busy setting of watches and ordering of outposts, and Olaf went with me to the top of our hill and there set a strong post of our men, for there could be no better place for a camp either for rest or defense, and the people told him that every Dane in the countryside had gone to Colchester, where they thought to be attacked. Now Bram the thrall had followed us to the hilltop, and while I sat and looked at the ruins of my home he left me and spoke to a group of countrymen who looked on at the warriors. There was one among this group whose face drew me, for I seemed to think that I ought to know him, though I could not say who he was. He looked like a poor franklin in his rough brown jerkin and leather-gartered hose, and broad hat, and he bore no weapon but a short seeks in his belt and a quarter-staff, and there was naught about him to claim notice. But I was watching for old friends of mine with a full heart, and scanned the face of each one that came near. Then it seemed that the others spoke to this man with a sort of reverence, and presently one bared his head before him. Thereat I knew who he was, and my heart leapt with joy, for it was good Father Aylwin, our priest, who had gone back to his death as we had thought. Then I made haste and went to him, dismounting before him. "Father," I said, "have you forgotten Redwald, your pupil?" He took my hand in silence, being too much moved to speak, and signed the sign of the cross towards me in token of blessing. I bowed my head, and rejoiced that he was yet living. Then Olaf called me, and I said, "When the warriors have dispersed, come to the house on the green that was Geth's. The king and I shall be there. We have much to say to one another, father." So I had to leave him at that time, for now Olaf would take 80 of our men in haste to Sudbury, which is but 5 miles away, and call on the townsfolk to rise for Ethelred and drive out any Danes who were left there. We went away quickly, and took all our mounted men, for we could hear of no Danish force afield yet. It is likely that word of our force had gone from Malden, losing nothing on the way. We rode to Sudbury gates and called on the townspeople to open their gates. Then was some tumult and fighting inside the town, but they opened to us, and we rode in. There were some slain men in the street, for what Danes had been there had resisted the surrender to so small a force. But the Sudbury folk rejoiced to see us, and hailed Ethelred as king very gladly. Then Olaf bade them raise what men they could and join him at Bears on the morrow with the first light. Thereat the old sheriff of Sudbury, whom I knew well, promised that we should have all the men whom he could raise. "Nor will they be your worst fighters, King Olaf," he said, "for we have many wrongs to avenge." It was late evening when we went back. And in the road where it winds between the river and the hill before one comes into Bear Street waited Ronnie and some men with news. The Danes had come from Colchester, and already their watch fires were burning along the heath some 4 miles to eastward of us. It had fallen out, as Olaf wished, that they would try to bar our way into Suffolk, and we should have worked a hand on the morrow. Now men had gone with some thralls who could take them safely near the host, to spy what they could of the number and the plans of the Danes. So it came to pass that I went no more into the village that night, but slept by a fire that burned where our own hearthstone had been, amid the ruins of my home. And that was a sad homecoming enough. Moreover, in the first hours of the night a wonderful thing happened which seemed to be of ill omen, and was so strange that maybe few will believe it. There was a bit of broken wall near the fire, and I laid me down in my cloak under its shelter, setting the sword that Edmund had given me against it close to my head, so that I could reach it instantly if need were. After a while I slept, for the day had been very long and I was weary, else would sad thoughts have kept me waking. And presently there was a rumble and snapping that woke me up in a dream of falling ruin, and the man who lay next to me cried out and dragged me roughly aside. The broken wall had fallen, crumbling with the heat of the fire, I suppose, and had almost slain me. But I was not touched, though the sword was broken. And when Otter the Skald heard of it he was troubled, not knowing what this might betoken. But Olaf thought little of it. "It means that axe is better than sword for this fight," he said, for he had armed me like himself after the Norse manner, than which is none better or more handsome. He had given me a birdie, 10, of the best ring mail, and a helm golden laid as became a king's kinsman, an axe and shield like his own. He and his men alone of all Norsemen in those days bore the cross on both helm and shield. Nor would Olaf have any unchristened man in all his host. Many a stout warrior did he turn away because he was not and would not be a Christian, for many Danes were yet heathen, and most Norwaymen. Some of the men who had gone out to see the Danish force came back soon after midnight, and they said that there would seem to be close on 1,000 of them in all. After that we knew that a hard fight was before us, and the king bade us sleep and take what rest we might. Then, very early, came men to say that the Sudbury folk had come, and Olaf and I went down to the village to meet them. Close on 200 men had come with Pratt, the son of the sheriff of Sudbury, at their head, and they were not to be despised, for they were sturdy spearmen, and many had mail, though the most wore the stout leathern jerkin that will turn a sword cut well enough. And Pratt asked that they should have the first place in the fight, seeing that they fought for their own land. "That is the place of my own ship's crew," said Olaf, "nor will they be denied it. Now shall you fight under Redwald, your own thane, and he will have the next place to me." That pleased both them and me well, and after that Olaf sent me on as advance guard, for we knew the country. We were 900 strong in all, and when I took my men to the hilltop I met a man who said that the Danes mustered some 1,500 strong. There were Anglian Danes there besides Thingmen. But Olaf had said that we would fight 2 to 1 if necessary, and so I held on. He would send after me if he would make any change in his plans when he heard this. It was well that we had settled with the Sudbury force already, or we should have had them to deal with besides. We left Bear's Hill and went down the steep valley beyond it, and I thought that the Danes might wait for us in the wood that is on the opposite slope. But there were none, and we came out on the open ground that stretches away in a fairly level upland for many a mile northward and eastward before us. There I waited, for we needed no advance guard beyond these last woodlands. One could see to the dip that is by Levenheath, and there the Danes would be. And indeed across the open rode a few men in that direction, and I knew that they were scouts who would take the news of our coming, but they were too far away to be stopped even had I wished to do so. Olaf would not be led far from Bears and the river, but would have the foe come to him. So we stayed just beyond the cover, and the bustards ran across the heath as we roused them, and the larks sprung up and sang overhead, and the blackbirds called their alarm notes in the copse behind us, and the men talked of these things and pointed at the rabbits that sat up to look at us before they fled, as if there were no fighting at hand. For indeed I think that one notes all these well-known things more plainly when one's mind is strung up and over-watchful, as it will be before. Somewhat great that is looked for. Then came Olaf at the head of his men, and as he came I saw the first sparkle of armor across the heath under the sun, for the Danes were in array, and were coming up to the level ground over which we looked. And when Olaf saw that his face grew bright with the joy of battle and a good cause, and his hand went to his sword while he looked quickly round for the place that he would choose. Nor was he long in choosing, for he led us but a furlong from the cover's edge, and there drew us up in a half circle, with the hollow towards the cover and our horsemen on the flanks, so that the greater force could not outflank us, while we had the wood in our rear. So if one half of the curved line was forced back it would but drive us closer together, back to back, and at the worst we could not be followed into the cover except by scattered men who would be of no account. Now the strongest part of our curved line was in the center, and there stood Olaf's male shipmen, and behind them my English spearmen. That place they liked not at first, till the king told them carefully what he would have them do at the first charge of horsemen for which he looked, for now it was plain that many of the Danes were mounted. Olaf and I stood between his men and mine, leaving our horses in the cover, for a Viking leader will ever fight on foot. Roddy was on the right wing, and Bjorn the marshal on the left, and Otter the skald bore Olaf's banner beside the king. There were 6 of the best warriors of the crew before Olaf as his shield wall, and 6 of the best English warriors had been named by Pratt to act in the same way for me. Olaf had given me a good plain sword in place of that which I broke, but I took a spear now, ashen shafted and strong, in the English way, that I might be armed as were my men, and I think that pleased them. The Danes came on fast, and they had not been miscounted. They were full half as many again as we, and they were drawn up in line with their horsemen on the wings as we were, so that at first I thought we should fight man to man, both horse and foot, along the whole front. Now they came almost within bow shot, and there they halted and closed up, leaning on their weapons, while a great man, tall and black-bearded, and clad in black chain mail, rode out before them and came towards us with his right hand held up in token of parley. Olaf went out from the line to meet him, and when they were close together a great hush fell on the two hosts to hear what was said. "Are you the leader of this host?" the Dane said. "Aye." "Who are you?" answered Olaf. "I am Egil Thorarensen, of Colchester," he answered. "And whoever you may be, I call on you to yield to Nut, King of Denmark and England, and Norway also." "Maybe he is king of neither," Olaf answered quietly. "I am Olaf Haraldsson, and I am here to see if he shall be king of England. So I call on you to submit peaceably to Ethelred, leaving Nut to take his own land if he can." "We are Nut's men and Danes," answered Egil, "and from your speech and name it would seem that you are no Englishman. Now if you are Olaf the Thick, own your own King Nut, and leave this Ethelred the Unready to his own foolishness. I am one of those Norsemen who hold that Nut is no king of ours, and therefore I fight him wherever I can. But if you will own Ethelred there shall be peace from him, and you will but do what the Danes of Guthrum's host did in the old days, hold the land you have won from an English overlord." "A fine overlord, forsooth," said the Dane. "Maybe one would think of it had he been a second Alfred but Ethelred the Unready." "Not so, King Olaf. Will you own Nut, or must we make you?" "It seems that we shall not agree until we have fought out this question," said Olaf, laughing a little. The Dane laughed back. I suppose not. I would that you had a few more men. But that is a hard lot in the center." And so he looked down our line with an unmoved face, and turned his horse and rode slowly back to his own men. Olaf came back to us with a confident look enough.